Costas, thanks for that big build-up. But my wife once told me that the secret to happiness in life is low expectations. So it's going to be tough. Okay, 41,156,321. Now, what does that number represent? What that number actually represents is the most watched TED Talk of all time, because that's how many views Sir Ken Robinson's talk has had. And what did Sir Ken Robinson talk about? He spoke about education. But in particular, what he focused on was a problem with education. Because what Sir Ken was talking about was the fact that many education systems around the world were built for an industrial age. And many of those education systems have not evolved to cope with a new digital age, a transformational age. So what Sir Ken talks about and what he focuses upon, and in fact what many people in many TED Talks have focused on, is educational reform. Now, I completely agree with Ken Robinson that we need to transform education, and what we need to do in particular is to help children retain and build their creativity. But the problem is, I've got kids now. So I don't want to wait to 2030 for the education system to be reformed. Because the reality is that I want my kids to be ready. So therefore what I've realized, and increasingly realized, is it's not just schools and teachers that have a responsibility for helping kids to keep and build their creativity, it's also us. So please raise your hand in this room if you have children. Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you're practicing. Raise your hand if you're an uncle or an auntie or a friend to a child. It's all of us. So what I'm going to talk about now actually I think is very meaningful. It's meaningful for everyone in this room. Now these are my three children. This is Charlie on the left and Reese and Hannah. And my wife Anami and I, we have a passion. We have a passion to want to keep their creativity alive. Now as an academic, what I've done is I've read the literature. I've looked at childhood development, I've looked at psychology, and more recently I've even looked at neuroscience. So what I want to share with you over the next 10 minutes or so is what I've discovered. What I've discovered from the research, but not just what I've discovered from the research, what we're actually practicing in our home. So all these photos you'll see, it's just the kids. It's our house. So what do we know? What do we know? The first thing is that kids need stuff. If you want your children to be creative, they need stuff. So this is our living room. This is little Charlie. And behind little Charlie, you see those colored boxes. In those boxes are art materials and glue and paper. You see books. You see a piano. You see an instrument. And if you came upstairs at our house, what you'll see is the big dress-up boxes. Now, what's the problem? A big problem with modern society is that we have the toy industries and the entertainment industries. And what these organizations bring is prefabricated imagination. They bring characters and they bring plot lines and they bring props. You know, when I was a kid, if you wanted to dress up as a Star Wars character, you wrapped yourself in tinfoil and had a broomstick and a sheet. But now if we go to the toy store, what do we find? We find the stormtrooper costume and the princess costume. Now, I'm not saying to you, don't buy your kids toys. Of course we should. But maybe we should do less of that. Maybe we should actually get them this other stuff. So, of course, one of the things that my kids have access to, what our kids have access to, is my garage. And in the garage, what do they find? They find nails and saws and hammers and so on, and they construct stuff. They've built their own tree house. Yeah? Now, this is very, very important because what kids also need to do to keep their creativity is to experiment, and they need to fail. One of the biggest killers of creativity is when children become afraid of failure and they're afraid of judgment. So it's about the process. It's not about the outcomes. My little boy Charlie, he recently came to me and he said, "Papa, can I borrow your chainsaw?" And I said, "Yeah, of course you can, Charlie. Okay, but of course I supervised him because I didn't want a tree falling on the neighbor's house or something, okay? But you see, this is extremely important, yeah? That they need these tools. Now, the other thing, of course, that kids need is they need space. So what you see in our house is just a little bit of space. And of course, they also need time. Now, the thing about creativity is it sometimes takes time to evolve. So the last thing we should do is clean up after every childhood play session, because actually sometimes creativity takes days. We should allow for those multi-day play activities. The other thing that we do as modern parents is we overstructure our time, our kids' time. We plan everything for them. And in fact, what children need is unstructured time. So the next time your children come to you and say, "I'm bored," what do you say? you say, great, go outside. Because boredom is often the trigger for creativity. Now, there's something else here, and that's screen time. Screen time is not all equal, okay? Now, of course, TV is very passive. TV does not encourage creativity. It's consumption. Social media, watch out for that one. Why is that? Because sometimes social media puts a pressure towards conformity, but also with social media, kids are too occupied. So they don't have the time for reflection and introspection, particularly important for teenagers. Gaming is very interesting. I read a paper recently about gaming. Now, creativity involves inventive and expressive creativity, and those two, of course, come together. So when you look at some online gaming like Minecraft, it's brilliant, actually, because it involves both expressive and inventive creativity. Now, the problem, of course, was I was explaining this to my wife, and my son Charlie overheard. He comes to me every day now and tells me how good Minecraft is for his creativity. Okay, but that's fine. So my message to you is take an interest. Take an interest in what your kids do online and understand that not all screen time is equal. This is my daughter, Hannah. Now, many years ago, when I was living in Melbourne, I lived next door to a Greek couple. And before I met the couple, actually, I met the grandmother. You know one of these old Greek ladies who looks like Darth Vader? And I remember I was in the front garden one day and she leaned over and said, "Hey boy, are you Greek?" Obviously very bad eyesight, Anyway, but the two little kids were with her, the two children of the couple, 5 and 7 years old. And I turned to the old lady and I said, "So who are these two?" I never forget what she said. She turned to me and said, "He is the doctor, she is the lawyer." What is that? We put too much pressure on our kids in terms of university and entrance and all that stuff. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, they never finished university. And many of those that did finish university, the people who go on to create great things, often they do it in fields that have nothing to do with their studies. So let's put a little bit less pressure on the kids. The other thing is stop worrying. Let's stop worrying about our kids getting kidnapped or hurting themselves, Okay, in some countries in the world that might be an issue, but in most countries it's not. Now, what's the problem here, Because kids, they will explore, they will have adventures. Earlier this year, my son Reese, who's 13, he hit a car on his bicycle. And it was terrible because the bike was destroyed and the driver of the car was completely traumatized. And, but Reese was okay. He bounced off the bonnet, he landed on the ground, he had a grazed elbow. It doesn't mean that we stop Reese riding his bicycle because he loves it and he needs that freedom and autonomy. We need to give kids that, In many countries, the US, Australia included, do you know that they're removing the high climbing bars from playgrounds? Why? Because they're afraid kids will get hurt. And they're afraid of litigation. But if we never allow our children to climb high, they will never dream of those far horizons. So we have to let them explore. Now, there's something else here, because, in our house, what we do is we celebrate creativity. In the bookcase, I'm a big fan of Banksy, the graffiti artist. There are books about Banksy. I talk about Hannah, about the meaning of that art. But equally, on a Friday night, we watch the BBC Strictly Come Dancing. It's wonderful. It celebrates movement. But equally in our house, we talk about entrepreneurs. And what the message we send to our children is creativity is present in every field of endeavor. It's in business, it's in art, it's in music, it's in sport, and of course, it's in business. But we celebrate that. Now, there's something else important here, and that's divergent thinking. So much of the problem with modern education is it encourages linear thinking, one right answer. So what I do a lot of with my children is I give them riddles and brain teasers. For example, a lady puts her hand in her pocket and she realizes there is something in her pocket, but there is nothing in her pocket. And it's not her hand. What is that? Now, as adults, we have a real problem thinking about this because it's divergent. The answer is a hole. You see, and if you practice these things with your kids, it develops different connections in their brain. They practice divergence. And what happens over time? They become better at the riddles. They absolutely become better at the riddles. So I encourage you to do that. Now, my kids love these riddles. Well, they mostly love them. I mean, my son Reese, we were sitting at the breakfast table a few weeks ago and I gave them a riddle. And Reese turned to me and said, "Papa, we're here to eat, not to have fun." Reese spent his formative years in Germany, so that's another story. Okay, there's something else here. There's something else here, and it's this. My little boy Charlie, he's wonderful. He's 9 years old. So a few weeks ago, I was really tired, and I was shouting at the kids, and Charlie turned to me, and do you know what he said? "Papa, you're tired and you're hungry. I don't think we should be having this conversation." And he was absolutely right, because kids need that too. Of course, kids need rest, they need sleep, they need nutrition, good nutrition, but they also need movement, they need sport. Now, why is that? Because now we're getting to the neuroscience. Because when you exercise, when you work hard, you do sports, you dance, you release dopamine in your system. And dopamine it's understood to boost active thinking, to boost alertness, and to boost creativity, actually. So kids need to move. Sport boosts dopamine. Now, of course, you can also boost dopamine with cocaine and sex. It's up to you whether you tell your kids that one, okay? That's it. Now, there's another thing, it's called oxytocin, right? Now, oxytocin is a chemical in our body that's... When do we get a rush of oxytocin? It's when we're in deeply loving, affectionate relationships. Now, why is this important for creativity? Because collaboration, invention, is about coming together. It's about listening to other people, empathizing with other people. Now, what is the research? So, very recent research. We can actually boost the oxytocin levels of children by hugging them. And in fact, what the research shows is that the optimal number of hugs per day before the oxytocin levels plateau is 7. So in our house, I give my wife, my 3 kids, 7 hugs a day, and then I say, enough. No, I'm just kidding. But we do talk about the have you had your hug quota today? Because it's important, okay? So here's what I want to leave with you, actually. This idea that we need to reform education. I absolutely agree with Ken Robinson. I absolutely agree with the TED speakers who talk on this topic. But it's not just schools that kill creativity. It's also parents that kill creativity. So in fact, what we need to do is we need to take accountability. And what we need to do is provide kids the resources they need, the time, the stuff. We need to build an environment in our homes that celebrates creativity. And of course, what we also need to do is make sure that our children are happy and healthy and loved. Thank you very much.